A game console is supposed to fail politely. A short message, an error code, maybe a suggestion to restart. But some consoles did something far worse. They turned red, screamed through the television, or replaced a familiar startup with something that felt almost deliberate. Millions of players saw these warnings without knowing whether their game, their console, or every saved memory inside it had just died. But the final error crossed an even stranger line, because it did not merely look broken. It looked as if the console itself had become afraid. The Xbox 360 made failure impossible to ignore. Microsoft launched the console in 2005 with aggressive pricing, powerful hardware, and a full year's advantage over the PlayStation 3. So for a while, it looked as if Microsoft had started the generation with everything under control. But inside many early units, repeated heating and cooling placed stress on critical hardware connections. The console could run hot during a long session, cool after being switched off, and repeat that cycle hundreds of times. Eventually, components could lose reliable contact, so the machine needed a way to announce that something had gone seriously wrong. Microsoft used the 4 illuminated sections surrounding the power button. One green section usually meant everything was normal. 2 red sections warned that the machine was overheating. 4 often meant the video cable was missing, which could produce several seconds of unnecessary panic before someone noticed the loose plug. But 3 red sections meant a general hardware failure. No helpful explanation appeared. No repair instructions softened the blow. The console simply replaced its friendly green light with 3 glowing red arcs. Players quickly gave the pattern a name inspired by Microsoft's infamous Windows crash screen, the Red Ring of Death. That name sounded dramatic, but the consequences were real. One moment, someone could be halfway through Halo 3 or Gears of War. The next, the screen was black, the controller would not connect, and the console stared back with 3 red lights. Online photos multiplied, repair tutorials appeared, and desperate owners tried everything from towels to improvised clamps. Some methods briefly changed the temperature inside the system, so the console might return to life just long enough to create false hope. The problem became so widespread that Microsoft extended warranty coverage and set aside more than $1 billion to deal with repairs and related costs. Later revisions improved reliability, but that did not erase the image. The red ring was frightening because it was simple. 3 lights could mean a repair box, weeks without a console, or the permanent loss of a machine that had been working 5 minutes earlier. But the Xbox 360's warning matched the seriousness of the failure. The hardware might genuinely be dead, so the red lights made a brutal kind of sense. The stranger question is what happens when a console uses the language of catastrophe for something harmless. Sony answered that with a scratched disc. The PlayStation 2 normally began in darkness. A low atmospheric sound rose as abstract towers appeared, so players learned to associate that sequence with anticipation. A game was seconds away. But insert a disc the console could not recognize, and the mood changed instantly. The blue darkness was consumed by a red tunnel-like screen. Technically, nothing supernatural was happening. The disc could be from another platform, badly damaged, incorrectly formatted, or unreadable. But the presentation made a basic compatibility message feel like a punishment. Sony could have used a neutral menu with a small icon. Instead, the console filled the television with pulsing red geometry and a sound that seemed to say you had done something forbidden. Players called it the red screen of death, even though the console itself was usually fine. That detail matters, because fear does not depend on actual danger. It depends on uncertainty. A child putting in a scratched game did not know whether the disc needed cleaning or the entire PlayStation 2 had failed. They only knew that the safe, familiar startup had suddenly become hostile. Certain original PlayStation models used a similarly ominous red message when they could not detect a valid PlayStation disc. But the earlier console made the transition even more unsettling. Its bright startup chime could stop, leaving a red screen in near total silence. The machine had not died, but it felt as though something had interrupted it. So the warning no longer needed to describe a disaster. It only needed to sound like one. Nintendo pushed that mismatch even further, because one of its most ominous errors could be triggered by nothing more serious than a missing accessory. The Game Boy Player was released for the GameCube in 2003. The hardware attached beneath the console and allowed Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance cartridges to appear on a television. But it also required a special startup disc. Imagine finding that disc years later, placing it into the GameCube, and hearing the familiar boot animation begin. The cube forms, the logo lands, and everything appears normal. But if the Game Boy Player hardware is not connected, the startup is interrupted by a dark error screen and a cluster of low, dissonant piano notes. The message is practical. The sound is not. Those notes are brief, but they feel less like a notification and more like the soundtrack to a locked room. Nothing is damaged. The console is simply telling you that an accessory is missing, but someone at Nintendo decided that this minor setup mistake deserved audio dramatic enough for a psychological horror game. That choice reveals something important. Engineers know exactly what an error means, so a warning may seem harmless to them. But the player sees only a familiar machine behaving in an unfamiliar way. The less explanation the console provides, the more the imagination supplies. Nintendo 64DD exposed the same problem in a harsher form. This Japan-only disk drive accessory could display stark error codes accompanied by abrasive electronic noise if its hardware was not connected correctly. The instruction might amount to little more than "check the manual," but the console delivered it like an emergency broadcast. A loose attachment could therefore feel catastrophic, but only for a moment. Once the missing hardware was identified, the mystery vanished. A far more disturbing warning gave players no such escape, because it suggested that the machine's entire operating system had stopped trusting itself. That warning appeared on the Nintendo Wii. The Wii was designed to feel welcoming. Its menus were white, its music was gentle, and its channels looked like friendly television windows. Nintendo sold it to children, parents, and grandparents who might never have touched a traditional controller. More than 100 million Wii consoles were sold worldwide, so its startup became part of ordinary family life. You press the power button expecting Wii Sports, Mario Kart, or a few rounds of bowling in the living room. But if important system data became corrupted, that bright interface could disappear. Instead, the Wii displayed a completely black screen with small white text. The system files are corrupted. There was no smiling me. There was no music. There was only a sentence announcing that the software holding the console together could no longer be trusted. This error was uncommon during normal use, but modified systems faced a greater risk if homebrew software, menu files, or system updates were handled incorrectly. In some cases, the damage could be repaired. But the screen offered no comfort, so the owner had no immediate way to know whether the fix would take 5 minutes or require specialist tools. That uncertainty made it worse than an ordinary disk read error. A bad disk affects one game. A missing accessory can be reconnected, but corrupted system files suggest that the console itself has forgotten how to function. All those save files, downloaded games, and digital purchases might still exist inside the machine, but the front door has vanished. The Wii's family-friendly design sharpened the contrast. A television that had displayed Cartoon Mias hours earlier now resembled a terminal after a total system collapse. But even this screen remained understandable. The Wii was still using a complete sentence. It knew what had failed, and it could tell you. The most unsettling console errors begin when that ability disappears. The original PlayStation startup is one of the most recognizable sounds in gaming. A deep electronic swell fills the room. The Sony Computer Entertainment logo appears and the second chime confirms that the disc has been accepted. Millions heard that sequence so often that every note became predictable. That predictability created comfort, but it also created the perfect conditions for something to go wrong. Modified hardware, corrupted data, damaged discs, or unstable components could cause the startup to collapse into bizarre audiovisual glitches. In fearful harmony, the normal Sony logo may appear, but the sound stretches and reverberates far beyond its usual shape. The screen can shift into strange colors or malformed graphics, while fragments of the startup audio repeat at a lower pitch. The PlayStation is attempting to perform a sequence everyone recognizes, but each part arrives damaged. It is close enough to be familiar, so every wrong note becomes more disturbing. Personified fear can be even more abrupt. The startup begins normally, but the audio breaks into warped noise resembling reversed glass or a metallic cry. The image may freeze, distort, or disappear before the console reaches the game. There is no red warning, no error code, and no sentence telling you to consult a manual. The ritual simply disintegrates in front of you, and this is the detail that makes those glitches more effective than every carefully designed warning before them. Nobody created them to be scary. They were failures produced when expected data, hardware behavior, or startup processes no longer aligned. The console was not displaying a horror screen written by a designer. It was trying to continue with damaged instructions. Its logo appeared because it still remembered part of the sequence. Its sound twisted because another part had already failed. For a few seconds, the machine seemed trapped between functioning and collapsing. That is why it could look almost afraid. The Xbox used red lights because they were visible. Sony used dramatic colors because they clearly separated failure from success. Nintendo used stark warnings because errors demanded attention. But the original PlayStation revealed something none of those designers intended. Once a console breaks its own familiar ritual, it no longer feels like a machine reporting a problem. It feels like something familiar suddenly speaking in the wrong voice. Maybe that is why these moments stayed with us long after the consoles were repaired or replaced. Machines built for escape briefly made us feel that even familiar worlds could become unrecognizable. Which console era frightened you the most? Share the one you still remember, and subscribe if you want to revisit more of gaming's strangest forgotten moments.